First online service. Welcome. Join us as we go through and do church online. Let me ask you a couple things. First off, have patience. This is our first try at this, and so if we have some technical glitches, bear with us, and we'll get them figured out. And a couple cool things about this online platform that we found that we're using. You can actually make comments as it goes along. You can say amen or make some kind of a comment on the message as it's going along. That's down in the bottom right-hand corner. You can click on that. And then you'll notice up in the top right-hand corner, there's the donate button. As you can guess, not having church will affect the income of the church, and we continue to operate and serve and meet the needs of the community. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't tried online giving before, that's a great way to do it. Just click on that donate button and it'll take you right to the online giving platform. So when we're done with the message and with the service, you can try that out. I'd encourage you to do that. Well, we are continuing on today our message in our teaching series through the book of 1 Peter. And we find ourselves at chapter 5 today. We're in chapter 5, verse 1. And we're going to go through a 7-verse chunk that ends in this verse. It says this, get this. It says, "Give all of your worries and cares to God, for He cares for you." Is that applicable for today? Is there anybody that has cares and worries? Anybody whose retirement has lost a little bit this week or the last few weeks? Anybody whose job is in question? Whose relationships, maybe you have relationships that you're concerned about their safety and health or yours. With this virus going through this pandemic, we are filled with cares, and this is a wonderful verse and scripture that we're going to look at. What we're going to do is we're going to work our way up to verse 7, starting at verse 1, because it gives a lot of information on how we can actually do that, how we can actually give those cares to God and be rid of them. So let's start in verse 1, and we'll just start working through it a little bit at a time. Verse 1 starts with these two words, "and now." And so what he's saying is, and now, it's kind of like, okay, you guys, with everything that I've said up to this point, it is the foundation for what I'm going to say as we continue on. In case you haven't been in New Life as we've started this series, been going through this series, let me give a quick recap on just what he's talking about, and now, what he said so far. If you remember, Peter is writing this letter to many churches, a group of churches all over Asia Minor. In fact, it's an area about 250,000 square miles. It's huge. And he's writing this letter to all of these Christians, many young Christians, trying to figure out how to be a Christian. What does it mean to be a Christian? And then on top of that, they are in the era, the rule of Nero, who is persecuting Christians. So not only are they figuring out just what does it mean to be a Christ follower, but in the midst of persecution that is so extreme that they are being killed, that they are being persecuted, they're losing their jobs and their positions. And so Peter gives them this advice. This whole letter is, what does it mean to be a Christ follower, especially in the midst of persecution? And what we're going to look at, and what we've been looking at, is that Peter gives a framework at the beginning of the letter that helps them understand basically the whole summary of what he's going to tell them. And what that is, it starts out with a worldview, a perspective. What Peter is trying to get them to understand, these Christians to understand, is that as a Christ follower, they have a radically different perspective on what it is, what life is. See, the typical person, there's two realities. There's the physical reality that we live in, but then there's also the heavenly reality. And most of us, as we go through life, before we become a Christ follower, we just live in this world. We base our hopes and our fears and our values and our dreams on this world. Getting ahead, being secure, having a nice home, having a nice car, having a secure, comfortable retirement. And none of those things are bad, but that's what we live for, having good relationships with our family. And what Peter's trying to get them to understand is that Christians, while we're still living in this reality, this world, we're actually driven. We're ambassadors. We are here, but we're sent from a different place. Our hopes and our dreams come from someplace else. We live with eternal values, and our hopes and our dreams and our desires are all determined by heaven, by the idea of as someday we will be with Jesus. And we'll look back, and the time here on earth will be a pinprick on the whole timeline of eternity. And so what Peter says, as he lays the foundation of, if you want to understand how to be a Christ follower, you have to understand this concept of reality and how we live and what we live for. And when you do, there's three things we've seen as we've studied so far that he says just start to happen. So the first one is, not only can we get through persecution and difficult times, but we can actually thrive. We can have joy. And the second thing that happens when we start to have this eternal perspective is that we start to live holy lives. And then the third thing is we are able to start loving deeply. The whole reason why we live is no longer for ourselves, but it's for God and for His heart and what He cares about. We're not overly focused on our health, on our finances, on our popularity. Instead, what we hear Peter say is, no matter how dire our circumstances seem, we can have hope and we can have joy, and because we're going to spend eternity with Jesus. When we look at our life through that lens, we realize that nothing of eternal significance can be threatened. And that's why we can have joy. Not only can we survive and get through difficult times, but we can have joy. So one other thing, before we start looking more in depth at the verses that we're going to for today, that is part of when he says, but now, part of the understanding that he's talking about is some of his discussions on holiness. One of the great things about 1 Peter is he just gives us not only those themes, those principles, that we can have joy in terrible circumstances, that we can start to live a holy life as a Christ follower, and that we can love, but he gives examples on how that really works out. What does that really look like in life? And let's look at holiness for just a minute, because it's going to affect the verses. The foundation that he's already laid will affect our understanding of the verses that we're looking at today. See, when we in the church think of holiness, or people outside the church, when we think of holiness, often we think of a list of things that we're not supposed to do. And as long as we don't do those things, then we're good. And in fact, often we don't do those things that we've listed, and then we look down on other people. That kind of an outlook actually divides. It doesn't shine the light on Jesus. And so Peter's spent verse after verse after verse talking about what holiness is. And it's actually much more about what we do, how we share the love of Christ with other people in a way that makes them look at us and say, wow, look at that. Whatever they have, that's what I want. And he gives a number of examples of holiness, and they each have to do with submission. So first he lists submitting to government authorities. That means things like obeying speed limits, obeying permitting laws, obeying stay-at-home laws. As a way of honoring God, we submit to authorities, and people outside that see that, and Christ is glorified. The next example he gives is how we submit to our bosses. And he doesn't say if they're a good boss. We submit to our bosses even if they're bad, unfair, and we work as hard as we can to make them successful. And through that, God is honored. That is holiness. And then he gave examples on how we honor and submit to our spouses through all of those different things. So submitting is something that is a common kind of a common theme for Peter in what holiness looks like. Submitting, not being a doormat, but what we do is we take our agenda, which is when we're in this world living for ourselves, we have an agenda. We base what we want and what we do based on what we want. And what he's saying is set that aside and think of other people. That's what he means by submitting. So, understanding all of those, that eternal perspective, and how when we are able to look at life through our anticipation of heaven, through God's heart and God's desires, if you understand those concepts and that concept, if you pick up 1 Peter, you'll be able to understand what he's saying any place in the book. So, that's what he's talking about when he says those two words. And now. Now, he goes on from there and he says, a word to you who are elders in the church. See, who's an elder? Who is he talking about here? Well, the New Testament actually uses 3 different terms interchangeably for a church leader, and one of those is elders. So an elder, if you look at 1 Timothy and in Titus, it gives lists of qualifications for an elder. And what you see is that an elder isn't necessarily somebody who has these great spiritual gifts, but it's somebody of godly character. So that's an elder. The other word, or a second word, that is used regularly in the New Testament interchangeably for a church leader is an overseer, or sometimes it's translated as a bishop. A bishop is somebody who, the emphasis on that is somebody who, the organization, the running of the church, the logistics, to superintend those matters of the running the church. And then the third term that's used for a leader in the church is a pastor. A pastor looks at the role more from a shepherd's heart, looking back on how God sees the church as his flock, and he is our shepherd. And so the pastor is the shepherd of this local flock. So when we think of church leaders, in our church structure, often we think of a single pastor or just a few pastors. But interestingly, that's not the emphasis or really the message of the New Testament. The New Testament talks about a plurality of leaders in the church. Let me give you a few examples. In Acts chapter 14, verse 23, Paul and Barnabas appoint elders in the plural in every church that they go to, in the singular. So similarly, in Acts 20, chapter 20, verse 17, it tells how Paul called to him the elders, plural, from the church in Ephesus. And then in Titus 1:5, Paul reminds Titus how he left him to appoint elders, plural, a number of elders, in every city. So over each church, there was a plurality of these elders, pastors, bishops, the leaders. At New Life, what that looks like is certainly our staff would be part of our elders. But we also have an official elder board, and then our deacon board would also be considered elders or church leaders. And I would say even our life group leaders. Life group leaders act in a pastoral role for each of those groups that they lead. If you are one of those church leaders, if you are a church leader, Paul is talking to you here as we go through these next few verses. Peter. And Peter continues talking about these church leaders. And it's interesting to note, as he starts talking about church leaders, he immediately uses Jesus as an example. Look at what he writes. He said, I too am an elder and a witness to the sufferings of Christ. Now, you might wonder, what does the sufferings of Christ have to do with being a church leader? What Peter is doing here, what he's saying is Jesus' attitude, his heart and his goals must be the model for our church leadership. Think about it. Peter walked along with Jesus. He saw the price Jesus paid. He saw Jesus going through the trial. He saw Jesus in how he was just crucified and treated. And what he's saying is that love that Jesus had to go through that for these people that he's caring for, that is our model as church leaders. We don't get into church leadership for what we can get out of it. Instead, like Jesus, we do it to serve others. So Jesus is our example. Peter's saying the responsibility of church leadership is to exercise authority with that same sacrificial attitude that Christ had. Now look how he continues on to build on that for church leaders. He says, as a fellow elder, I appeal to you to care for the flock. Look at those words, care for the flock. Peter's request calls to mind just a familiar biblical theme of how the church is a flock. And God is our shepherd. Jesus is our shepherd. Jesus multiple times talked about how he was the good shepherd. It's harder maybe for us to understand what that example, that illustration really means, because we don't see a lot of sheep and we don't maybe have experience being shepherds. But the people in Peter's day would have understood clearly what it meant to be a shepherd, to walk alongside, to care, to watch out for, to tend, to feed, to take to green pastures. Similarly, that's what a good leader does. They get to know their flock. Just like Jesus said, they know my voice, and they lead. Sheep can't be driven like cattle or some other animals. They have to be led, and that is the role of a leader. See, sometimes a church leader will have to do church discipline, or will have to take hard stands of, no, we will not go by that teaching. But really, the majority of the time, what a church leader does is they lead by their godly character. That is how a church leader leads. So look at how Peter continues then from that. He says, lead, care for the flock that God has entrusted you. The word translated entrusted you underscores the fact that the flock belongs to Jesus. It's not ours. It's not the leader's flock. The flock belongs to God, and the leader will be held accountable to God, how he led this flock that he was entrusted to. So how Peter then goes on to illustrate how do you lead then, he gives 3 examples of opposites in a sense. Don't do this, but do this. Look at the first one. He says, watch over it willingly, but not grudgingly. So he's talking about the attitude that church leaders lead by. Our attitude, leaders, matters. And then Peter goes on to give another example. He says, the second contrast is not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. So I'm sure all of us have seen leaders in the church and in other areas of our life that have gone into leadership for the wrong reason. He's saying our motivation does matter in church leadership. And then finally, the third contrast that Peter uses is he says, don't lord it over the people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example. That's a tall order. You get the sense that church leadership shouldn't be aspired too lightly. That Peter is trying to highlight that leadership is more of a responsibility than a privilege. If a person is into leadership for the perks, whether it's status or money or power, they are in leadership for the wrong reason. In fact, leadership, whether in the church or the home or the government, means that you guys are the one that God will hold accountable for how those under you go or fare. Thus, the requirement for leadership we see from Peter here is a close personal walk with Jesus. And the responsibility of a leader is to exercise oversight and care for God's flock with the right attitude and the right motivation. So finally, Peter concludes his words to church leaders with this encouragement. He says, "And when the great shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of never-ending glory and honor." Church leaders, it's difficult, often. It's discouraging at times, but if you hang in there, if you hold tight and serve faithfully, you will be rewarded and crowned in glory. At the end of his letter here, as Peter's winding down his letter, he's imploring church leaders to be faithful in these difficult times. Be faithful. And then from there, he moves quickly to talking about those who the leader serves. Leaders have a big responsibility, you guys, but what we're going to see is so do those who are being led. For the sake of unity in the church. And remember, unity and is to shine a light on Jesus. For the sake of unity, those who are being led, Peter says, are to submit. Look at what he calls out, or what he encourages those who are being led. He says, "In the same way, you who are younger must accept the authority of the elders." Now, when he says you who are younger, he's not talking about young people of age. He's talking about people who are younger in the faith, people that are less mature. And basically what he's saying is, if you aren't an elder, you are following. And I'm speaking to you now. And so this is what he says. He says to accept their authority, to submit to them. Now, submission doesn't mean mute exception of whatever is said. There's a place, certainly, that the New Testament lays out for expressing disagreement and voicing concerns. But submission here that Peter's talking about is primarily an attitude of respect and recognition of rank. If the elders go against a clear principle of Scripture, it's the responsibility of the flock to point that out and to call that into question. But what Peter is emphasizing, normally, most of the time, the flock needs to submit and to cooperate with the elders as they seek to follow God's will. I fear that we in America, in democratic, independent America, have a struggle with this part of church and church leadership. See, it's easy for us in the church, culturally, to treat church more as a club than as a church. A club in the sense of, I'm going to join this group of people that will meet my needs as long as I agree with the direction, as long as I feel my needs are being met, as long as this works for me, I'm going to be part of this group. But if the leadership changes or does something I don't like, or if I feel like I'm not being met, then I'm just going to remove myself. And I'm going to go to a different club that more is what I want at this time. But that's not the picture that we get from Peter here of church. He's saying, and it goes back to this whole basic worldview understanding of the two realities. So see, if we are living in this world for our own needs, that club mentality makes sense. But if we are living over here, driven by God's heart and God's ideas, we understand that submission and our church body is much more like our family. If one of your family members makes a bad decision or does something wrong, you don't just kick them out of the family. We stick by them. And similarly with our church, we get the idea from Peter here that our bonds are that or even more in how we submit to our elders and love and stay connected to each one. So, with a different level of commitment in our church, we treat it more like family. It changes how we submit and how we treat leaders. See, Peter never says submit to the leaders as long as they know more about church than you do, as long as they're making good decisions. That's not what he says. He says submit to the leaders. And interestingly, when Peter uses the word submit in the Greek, both here to the leaders, but also in the past when he's talked about submitting to the government authorities, submitting to your bosses, submitting to your spouses, this Greek word submit, he uses it in the middle voice. So what that means, it's not a one-time action of submit. It is an ongoing action that starts from the inside. So it's an action of my heart that works itself out into regular activities in my life. It is submitting on a regular basis. In a sense, it's submitting or sitting down on the inside and on the outside. So what's the biggest difficulty, you guys, in submission? Well, for me, it's pride. And what's the hardest part of leading? It's pride. So what's the solution to both of those? Well, it's humility. And so Peter goes on to give us ideas of how to work through that. Look at what he says. And all of you dress yourself in humility as you relate to one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humble yourself under the mighty power of God, and at the right time, he will lift you up in honor. Do you see those words? Dress yourself in humility. That word, it's a phrase, it's actually the word of putting on clothes. And it's not any clothes, it's the servant's apron that he's referring to. That's what that word refers to. And I'm sure, think of Peter, he was there with Jesus. When Jesus put on that towel, that robe, to go down and wash the disciples' feet in humility. I'm sure, or I would guess, that's the image going through Peter's mind. And as he says, clothe yourself. Put on that very humility that Jesus put on as you're serving, as you're leading, as you're submitting. Throughout this study of 1 Peter, as we've looked at these two realities, have you noticed that humility is kind of like the key component? See, as we live in this world for our own desires, we live for ourselves. We live for our own desires, for our own agenda, for our own hopes. It's about us. But on the other end, when we live for eternal values, that's humility, and it's based on humility. See, humility is really an understanding of who God is. Humility is not trampling down on us and putting us down. It's just a proper understanding of who God is and who we are in comparison. So God isn't just a little bit better than us. Humility is understanding that God is so much better and that he knows so much more. And if he has us and this world in control, what he knows is going to be so much better of a plan. And so humility is choosing to put ourselves into that position. But our pride demands, wants to be heard. Peter, though, says, clothe yourself with humility. Tomorrow morning, when you get up, I encourage you to pull out that drawer and to pull out humility. It's tucked way back in, behind the socks. You have to reach for it, it's difficult. But pull it out and dress yourself in that humility as you go to work, as you go to school, whatever it is that you're doing. Dress yourself in humility. Choose to consider others better than yourself. And so all of that, Peter is building up to this final verse that we started with. Verse 7. The next verse says, give all your worries and cares to God, for He cares about you. Now, have you ever wondered, when you're reading through this, and in that paragraph he's talking about submitting to the authorities, and then he closes it by saying, give all of your cares and worries to God. Have you ever wondered, what do those two have in common? And how do we do that? Well, when we look at that, when he says, give all of your cares, the word is actually a transfer of ownership. So what he's talking about, he's not saying, take all of your cares and worries and just shove them off you. But he's saying, hand them to God, and God will take them from you and relieve you of them. And He will take ownership of those. So you're trusting God to take care of things because He cares for you. I love that language that he uses there. It reminds me of being a dad. When my kids were small, they would often say, Dad, will you help me carry this thing that was too heavy for them? And so I would carry it for them. They don't ask me to do that very often anymore, except when they go to move apartments. And then it's usually to a third floor apartment. But I remember when they were small, they would say, Dad, will you carry this for me? And when sometimes they would even say, will you carry me? That's the kind of imagery this is. Dad, this is too heavy for me. Will you carry it? So here's the reason why Peter links handing our cares to God and submitting to church leaders and their authority. It's not an accident. Let me explain why. See, the problem isn't giving our worries to God. It's on the flip side of that is the control. See, we would be happy, I would be happy to give God my worries, but I love to have control. I want to hold that steering wheel, that driving wheel, so I can control where we go just in case I need to make a decision. But they're flip sides of the same coin. And with the control comes the responsibility for how things end up. And so part of learning to give God or giving God our worries is giving Him control of our life, and that's the hard part. I say, God, I want you to be Lord of my life, but in this area I'm going to have to make the decision just so I can be sure it's done right. And so what happens is God gives us a number of spiritual disciplines. This is a principle that's found over and over in the Bible. He gives us a number of spiritual disciplines to help us give Him more and more control of our life. Let me give you a few examples. One of them is tithing. Tithing, we are asked to give 10% of our income to God, to the church. And it's easy for us to think, oh, this is just about money. And it is about money, but it's not primarily about money. If God just wanted money, He could get it from wherever. It's much more about lordship. See, money is one of the most important things to me. And it's easy for us to say, oh, I'll give you control of my life, God. But in the finances, I need to maintain control just so I know it's done right. And by taking a step of obedience and giving God our tithe, his tithe, giving that to him, we're saying, God, maybe I don't know how I'm going to make ends meet with the other 90%, but you asked me to, and I am going to trust you. And when we take that step of trust, what happens is God is able to mold our life to make us a little bit more so we can give him more control of our life. And he does these disciplines in the areas of our life that are most important to us, like our money. Another one is our time. Sabbath. God asks us to set aside one day where we don't do the regular work that we normally do, and we rest. So Sabbath is about rest. It's about time. But it's much more about lordship. See, for me, and Sabbath is even harder to do than tithe. But for me, what I do is I have all of these list of things that I feel like I have to do. And so it's easy for me to say, God, yeah, I know I need to be resting today, but you don't understand. This and this and this need to get done. So I'm just going to do those. Do you understand what's happening? I'm trumping God. I'm saying, I know better. You've told me to set aside this day. But I'm saying, I know better in this case. When instead we can obey him and set aside one day. What he does is he takes that and he's able again to mold us a little bit more to be in control, to allow him to be in control rather than us being in control. It's a spiritual discipline. And the same thing happens here. We are unable to give God our cares and worries because we want to hold on to the control. And one of the things that Peter is saying here is that if we will submit to the authorities in our local church, yes, God will be honored. People from the outside will look at our church body and say, how is it that those people can get along so well when nobody else can? And God will be glorified. And people will say, I want whatever it is that they have. That will happen. But what Peter's saying is there's actually a practical benefit to submitting. Not only to submitting to the government authorities, to submitting to our bosses, submitting to our spouses, but maybe even more so when we submit to our church leaders, who maybe we feel like we know better how the church should be run. We maybe know better how to do things or what should be done. Peter's not saying submit to the church authorities because they know better. He's saying submit because God has put them in authority over you. And when we can take that spiritual discipline and choose to sit down, not only physically, but inside, to submit to those church authorities, what God can do then is he takes our heart, he molds it through that discipline, and he allows us, he helps us to make Jesus a little bit more the Lord of our life. And every time we choose to submit, especially when we really don't want to, God molds us a little bit more. It's through those disciplines that God takes us, and he takes the knowledge that we have in our head. Yes, I want to make God the Lord of my life. And I know that I should make God the Lord of my life, but it doesn't seem to work. He takes that head knowledge and he transfers it down to our heart, and he makes it heart knowledge when we choose to obey him in those disciplines. That's my hope for each one of us today. Those of you that are listening, wherever you're at in your relationship with Jesus, maybe you've never chosen to follow him, and today is the day you want to say, Jesus, I want to make you the Lord of my life. Or maybe you've been a Christian for 50 years and you know a lot about the Bible, but in your heart, there's a lot of areas where you haven't allowed God to be the Lord of your life. Choose to submit. And God will use that to make you a little bit more like Christ. It's hard, and it takes a long time. It's a lifelong process of submitting and submitting again. And God uses that to mold us more and more to be like Christ. Pray with me. Dear Jesus, thank you for what you've done for us, that you, in your leadership, cared enough about us, that you suffered and died for us. God, as church leaders, those of us who are church leaders, help us to have that attitude and desire to serve others in the way that you did. Help us to be effective leaders that lead from a godly standing and draws people towards you, leads people towards you. And God, for each one of us, we all struggle with lordship, making you fully Lord of our life. God, I pray that you will use these lessons that Peter is giving to a church 2,000 years ago and giving to us. I pray that you will help us to internalize these lessons and to follow through, to take steps of obedience so you can work in our life to make us who you want us to be. And through that, may you be glorified. May people see our lives, especially in these difficult times, and say, wow, what is it that they have? Because I want that. May you get all of the glory.